So anyway, I went to medical school, and I can tell you that it was like the shock of my life. I'm sure if you looked back at me at that time, you would probably be like, how did this guy write Pathoma? But I'll be honest, there was no way I was going into pathology. I was done. I had already done 3 sub-Is. I had my spot in peds. A lot of times people get into medicine and they keep a counter. They say, well, I got 4 years of medical school, I got 3 years of residency, and maybe a year of fellowship, and then I'm going to be practicing, etc. I think that the day you start medical school, you got to just put away the calendar. There's no counting anymore. What are you counting? Train as long as you would like to. I would even argue the longer you can train, the better. And the more fellowships you do, the better. When I advise people, I advise them to do up to 2 and 3 fellowships. If you're not eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, why do you want to talk about what vitamins you should eat? We got to start with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And breakfast, lunch, and dinner for us is 5 prayers in a day. For those following the Islamic tradition, that's our core. That's our spine. That's our backbone. What is the goal of medical education? We think the goal of medical education is step 1. No, that is not. Step 1 is just an unfortunate consequence of medical education. But I wouldn't say that the goal of medicine has anything to do with step 1.
اللهم رحمتك أرجو فلا تكلني إلى نفسي طرفة عيني وأصلح لي شأني كله اللهم لا إله إلا أنت لا إله إلا أنت وحدك لا شريك لك اللهم رحمتك.
All right, we can get started, inshallah. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. I'd like to start with the words of Imam al-Shafi'i, one of the greatest Islamic scholars in history, who said that, I don't know of a knowledge more noble than medicine after the knowledge of the halal and haram. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Kansas City University College of Osteopathic Medicine, I would like to thank you all for being with us tonight. My name is Muhammad Nuruddin, and I am a third-year medical student here at KCU, where I also happen to serve as the president of the MSA and the chair of the Cardiology Club. I have the privilege of being your host for tonight's event, and I'd like to extend a very special thanks to the MSA of Midwestern University, Chicago College of Osteopathic Medicine, the MSA of the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine, and the Sacred Learning Center for helping make this event possible. So, to set the stage for tonight's event, when we think of the most influential pioneers in medical education of the last decade, a few names quickly come to mind. Dr. Jason Ryan of Boards and Beyond, UWorld, Sketchy, First Aid, and of course, a name we all know and love, Dr. Husain Abdul Sattar of Pathoma. So tonight, we are honored to welcome Dr. Husain Abdul Sattar. His reputation certainly precedes him, and he's in no need of an introduction. But for those who may be unfamiliar, Dr. Husain Abdul Sattar is a Chicago native who attended the University of Chicago, a world-class institution where he studied Arabic, Islamic civilization, and biology, ultimately obtaining his Bachelor of Science degree with honors. He went on to the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine, one of the best medical schools in the country, where he earned his MD degree with distinction. Thereafter, he joined U Chicago Medicine, aka the University of Chicago Medical Center, a world-renowned academic hospital where he completed residency and fellowship training in a combined anatomic and clinical pathology program, serving as chief resident during his final year of residency. He is now a professor of pathology and a surgical pathologist at the University of Chicago, specializing in breast pathology. In addition to founding Pathoma, Dr. Abdul Sattar has also authored the Female Genital System and Breast chapter in an edition of Robbins' Basic Pathology, which is regarded as one of the most fundamental texts in the field of pathology. Beyond his career in medicine, Dr. Abdul Sattar is deeply involved in Islamic education and spiritual guidance. During medical school, he paused his studies to travel to Syria and Pakistan, where he immersed himself in the Islamic and spiritual sciences under the most esteemed scholars. After completing his religious studies, which culminated in an Islamic seminary degree and obtaining the title of Sheikh or scholar, he returned to complete his MD degree. Sheikh Abdul Sattar was involved in establishing the Sacred Learning Center in Lincolnwood, Illinois, which serves as a mosque and educational center for the Muslim community. He has authored several books in the Islamic sciences, including Fundamentals of Classical Arabic, Hajj and Umrah Perfecting the Journey, Rest Stops of Remembrance, Nurturing Mountains, the Spiritual and Legal Dimensions of Charity, and Spiritual Development and the Pursuit of Excellence. Sheikh Abdul Sattar holds weekly lectures at the Sacred Learning Center, where he seamlessly and passionately integrates both faith and science in a presentation style identical to his Pathoma lectures. These lectures can be found on the Sacred Learning website and on Spotify. With that, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Sheikh Dr. Husain Abdul Sattar. So, dear Sheikh, Assalamu alaikum. We are truly honored to have you with us. How are you doing?
Alaikum salam. I'm doing very well. Alhamdulillah, thumma alhamdulillah. It's an honor and pleasure to be able to spend this time with you and the students. And I'm humbled that you invited me to be able to actually, I'm more of a participant, but to be able to just be here with you today.
Alhamdulillah. I know you're having some technical difficulties with the video, which we can hopefully resolve soon, but we can hear you just fine. So just a quick agenda for the audience. You wanted to structure this as an audience-driven discussion where questions are submitted in the chat live as we speak. And I'll try to organize them into themes as we go so that it's more streamlined. And you wanted a more conversational format with reflective summaries of your points for the benefit of the latecomers. But I hope doing this won't take the focus away from you. So do you want to still keep the format this way, or do you want to change it?
Of course. No, that's perfect. Wonderful. The goal here is to have a conversation. I know there's a lot of people online, but I could sit and just talk, but it's going to be theory. If we talk about the issues that you face and the topics that you want to discuss, I'll let you guys drive it.
Okay, sure. I don't know how effective I'll be at providing concise reflective summaries, but I'll do my best, inshallah. So while we wait for the questions to start coming in, I'll start us off with our first theme of encouragement and wellness, inshallah. So as we all may know, the residency match is in a few weeks and board exams are coming up soon. And it's always a very doubt-inducing and stressful time for many of us. And we're all at different stages in our lifelong journey as physicians and healthcare professionals. So with that preface, could you please share some advice on encouragement and wellness?
Maybe the key thing I'll start off with is just to congratulate all of you on all of your achievements so far. It's not easy where you've gotten to. If you don't have kids already, one day you may. And when you have kids, you'll realize how hard it is to raise children, and then in fact to get them to the stage where you are, is a really, really big thing. And I think that's just a sign of all of the incredible things that you'll be able to achieve throughout your careers. Now, I will say that one of the questions that I often get asked, and maybe I'll just sort of cut off this potential question. A lot of students ask me, hey, you've obviously gone through medical school and then you've spent 20 years now, I guess it's 15 years as an attending. So what is the one thing you wish that you would have learned as a medical student that you didn't necessarily spend the time on or perhaps weren't taught? And I would just mention to all of you that I think the number one thing that I've learned in this sort of, let's say, halfway or midway through my career is that it's so important to stay balanced and to know who you are, to stay grounded, and never forget why you're doing what you're doing, and never forget that you're a human being just like everybody that you hope to eventually treat one day, which basically means that you're going to have to stabilize yourself and ensure that you maintain your own wellness in order to be able to share that wellness with others. And I use the term wellness here because really that's the key foundation upon which our ability to heal is going to be built. Meaning, if we're not well, it's going to be difficult and hard to be able to heal others. So my one piece of advice to kick this off is that if there's anything that you think about as you're planning your careers and you're planning how to stabilize yourselves and develop yourselves, don't ignore the fact that along with a bunch of knowledge, which I actually have no doubt that you're going to gain over time, you do need to maintain your own wellness. So that's something to just keep in mind. And maybe that'll be the opening message, and then we can have a conversation from there.
SubhanAllah. Thank you for your encouraging words and crucial advice. Your message deeply resonates, especially as we at KCU grieve the recent loss of two of our classmates. And sadly, many of us know or have heard of others who faced similar struggles. And your advice is a timely reminder of the challenges we encounter in medicine, where wellness, particularly mental health, is often overlooked. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us all and grant us the strength to maintain our wellness so that we can become the best healthcare providers as we embark on this lifelong journey. Ameen. And we'll come back to this theme of wellness in just a bit. But now that we've got a good number of questions submitted, I'd like to pivot into another theme I see here in the chat questions, which I'll categorize as your inspiration for science and medicine. So could you please tell us what sparked that interest?
Yeah, so I can tell you that I kind of came to medicine. Well, I came to science in a roundabout way, and then I came to medicine in a furthermore in a roundabout way. And I was thinking about this recently because someone was asking me this question, and I was doing an interview. I think what got me initially interested in medicine, in particular biology, was that as a child, in a very odd way, I was very interested in finance, economics, and particularly the stock market. Now, this was like 1980s, late 1980s, and I was kind of thinking back about my childhood, and I do remember that on occasion there would be this program that would be on PBS or one of these channels that my dad would regularly watch, which was this like Wall Street Week. I can't remember the full title of the program, but it was like a weekly program where they would like review all the things that happened on Wall Street that week. And during the 80s, there was a strong emphasis. It was like there was a really strong stock market at that time, and many of even the common culture was people were getting involved in the stock market. There were some very, very, very famous incidents that occurred there, including that famous crash of 1987, if I recall, 1987, where that crash occurred. And anyway, I was so into this that I literally would have I remember in fourth, fifth grade, I would have like my textbook for whatever class we were studying. I would have that open, and then underneath that, I would have this book about investing or Wall Street, or there's some famous books from the time, and I vividly remember reading those books at that time. What ended up happening was one of the companies that IPO'd at that time was called Genentech, and I got really interested in Genentech and what they did, and somehow that eventually piqued an interest in science. I was also interested in science at that time, but that kind of was my first exposure. And then over time, I began to develop an interest in science, did a science fair project when I was in 7th and 8th grade, and I think what really drove that interest in that project at the time was my interest in Genentech. Anyway, long story short, eventually I decided that I wanted to go into biotech. And as a high school student, I applied for a summer internship in which they taught high school students how to sequence DNA and how to clone DNA. So it's very strange. I mean, this is like 1990s, or late 1980s. Sequencing DNA, I was doing that at that time, particularly in high school. But I had that deep interest, and I actually attended this program in California where I was there for 2 months. I learned all these techniques, and then I came back, and as a high school student, I began working in a research lab. And that research lab actually it's still a famous lab till today. Richard Morimoto ran that lab. I practiced in that lab, and I was a young investigator in that lab. And then eventually I worked my way up to go to the University of Chicago. Pretty much went there because my mentor had gone there. Dr. Morimoto had actually gone there as well for his PhD. And then eventually I ended up in a few other labs at the university, and that's how I got interested. That's kind of how my interest in science developed. And that takes me up to college at this point. And then eventually from there, the lab that I was working in had a lot of MSTPs in it. We're doing MD PhDs. And that eventually had an effect on me where I began to then think about doing a medical degree. And that's what then led me to medical school. So very nonlinear path. I could tell you all the way up until junior year of college, I didn't even know I was going to go to medical school. I thought I was doing a PhD. I thought I was going into biotech, probably going into industry. But all of a sudden made this switch when a lot of the MD PhDs in the lab convinced me that you got to do an MD in order to be able to maintain your sort of focus on human disease and be at the cutting edge of how to solve problems in human disease. And that eventually led me to medical school. It's kind of a bit of a non-traditional route.
I think your story resonates with many of us in that our journeys to medicine aren't always linear. Some of us have taken gap years, others have transitioned from different careers into medicine, and some rediscovered their calling after taking a leave of absence to reflect and rejuvenate. But subhanAllah, your story teaches us that as long as we have a willingness to work hard, the drive to achieve, and moments to recalibrate our compass, that we will reach our destination, inshallah. So this perfectly segues into the next theme from the chat questions, which I'll categorize as your leave of absence. So could you please tell us what influenced you to take your leave of absence from medical school?
So essentially what, again, I gave you the story how I got to medical school. So now I guess we get to the story of how I left medical school. So anyway, I went to medical school, and I can tell you that it was like the shock of my life. And the problem with medical school was, for me, the speed and the pace at which the knowledge was kind of thrown at me. Now, mind you, I'm coming from a research background where you get a chance to think about all of the work that you're doing. You get to process, you get to plan. The pace is controlled by you. If you want to do 10 experiments a week, you do 10. If you want to do 2, you do 2. And all of a sudden, as soon as I got into medical school, it was completely different, meaning the pace at which the knowledge was thrown at me and the inability to be able to reflect and think through all that knowledge, and the rush of work and the need to get from A to B to C as quickly as possible was just completely overwhelming. So I actually, first couple of years of med school, really just had trouble digesting. I'm sure all medical students go through that, but for me, it was just very painful. I'm sure if you looked back at me at that time, you would probably be like, how did this guy write Pathoma? But, you eventually get to the parts where you're supposed to get to. So eventually what I can tell you that kind of the first sign that I was going to do something non-traditional was at the end of first year, they gave us the option to work in clinics and sort of connect up with individuals that we might want to be with for our specialty. Like maybe you work with a orthopedic surgeon if you're interested in orthopedics, for example. And eventually what I decided to do was to go to Damascus for the summer. At that time, Damascus was kind of a place where people would go to learn the Arabic language. And I was getting more into my religion at that time as well. And so I decided that I wasn't going to do anything clinical. I was going to just go to Damascus and just reset. Again, part of me wanted to just have space and time to think, and another part of me actually desired to be able to just do something a little bit different. And of course, in this case, it would be religious as well. So anyway, I did go to Damascus. I had a time of my life. It was a wonderful opportunity. I learned a tremendous amount. I had a great exposure to some people that I was able to benefit from. I was with my wife and my young newborn. No, actually, at that point, we didn't have a newborn. So it was just myself and my wife, and we all benefited greatly. So, of course, I came back to medical school, went through second year, and at the end of second year, made a decision that I was going to go into medicine, internal medicine. And my long-term goal was oncology, hemonc. So I did my sub-I, got my letter, was all set. And then maybe I did the first quarter. There was probably about 8-9 months of medical school left before I was going to graduate. And at that point, I pulled the trigger and decided to go abroad and leave medical school for 3 years. Actually, I was away. Why did I decide at that point? It wasn't just some random thought. I was already thinking about the fact that I needed to be away and that I wanted to spend some time resetting. And I also wanted to spend some time building on what I had learned in Damascus. And I just thought, if I don't do it now, there'll be no other opportunity. Again, I was also overwhelmed with all of the amount of learning and studying that we had done, and so much of the knowledge I felt just had gone over my head. So for a bunch of reasons, I eventually took that time off. And, it wasn't just that I disappeared. It was an official leave of absence. There was an agreement between me and the medical school that I would do some basic requirements that would allow me to be able to take credit, a bit of credit, not a lot, for the time that I spent abroad. And so I was able to complete those things as well. But I basically left medical school for 3 years and then came back. And when I came back, I then went through a series of different rotations before I eventually landed in pathology.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Abdul Sattar. I'm sure that speaks to many of us who may feel the need to recalibrate our compass and check in with our wellness, as we had discussed earlier. And hearing how someone as successful and influential as yourself took time away for personal wellness and returned even stronger as a physician is both empowering and encouraging. And your story reminds us that with thoughtful planning and the right steps, taking a leave of absence can be a powerful step toward long-term success and fulfillment. And I think we have a great train of thought going. We talked about before med school, during the first few years of med school, and taking time away from med school. So I think the next theme from the chat questions can be categorized into 2 parts. So part 1 connects being abroad to pathology, and part 2 connects pathology with Pathoma. So the summarized question I'll pose is, how did being abroad influence you to do a pathology residency? And subsequently, how did your pathology residency experience lead to the creation of Pathoma?
Yeah, well, let me just, I guess we're picking up the story then. So the next thing that happened was I went abroad. And when I went abroad, I lived in a few different places. I lived in Damascus for some additional time, spent some time in Pakistan, as you mentioned. And so after having that experience, because I was living like a local, and these were developing countries, I was just a witness to so much suffering. And I concluded at the end of that period of time that I wanted to go into peds, and particularly international medicine and peds. So I came back, I did some sub-IC peds, I was all set. I actually did some sub-IC peds, was all set to go into peds. And then at the very end of my peds rotation, there was actually a patient who had a platelet count above 1 million. And the attending sent me down to the path lab to review slide on this patient with his platelet count. And honestly, I didn't even have pathology on my radar at that time. But I went down to the path lab, and I think that one thing that impressed me was the amount of time they spent talking and teaching me about that, talking me through and teaching me about that slide. And I can tell you that more than the pathology, I was just very intrigued by the fact that they had the time to think and reflect in that almost lab-like atmosphere that I had grown up in. Because remember, I was in labs from the age of 14. And so that just attracted me a little bit and made me think about the possibility of pathology. But I'll be honest, there was no way I was going into pathology. I was done. I had already done 3 sub-Is. I had my spot in peds. So I kind of just buried the thought away, but it was no more than a fleeting thought. But then what happened was the American Society for Clinical Pathologists, it might be that, it might be one of the other societies, I forget at this point, basically sent out an offer to all medical students that anybody who would do a rotation would get $1,000 to do their rotation as a stipend. And that's because there were so few people going into pathology at that time that they were trying to attract people to just try the rotation. So I applied and I was accepted, and I eventually got a spot as a rotating medical student in this one private practice hospital kind of private practice, kind of academic. And they hooked me up with a pathologist. And it's so interesting that that pathologist actually happened to be a pediatrician. So, kind of had some commonality there as well. This wasn't purposeful. It just happened to be that way. But eventually, by the end of the rotation, I was certain that I wanted to do pathology. So that caused me to switch to pathology very last minute. Honestly, I only applied to one program, and I actually used my pediatric application for pathology. I didn't even write a new application. There was no time. So anyway, I got this position in pathology, obviously. Because I was so behind, in the sense that I never planned to be a pathologist, my knowledge base was so limited, I literally had to really relearn everything. So as part of that relearning process, I actually became a TA for the pathology class. After being a TA, I then went on to become a resident TA for the main pathology class, which our main pathology class is called Clinical Pathophysiology and Therapeutics. It's an integrated class. Eventually, as a junior attending, I became a course director, like a low-level course director. Eventually, I became more of an associate director. And it's through that interaction that over time, I began to recognize that medical students were not seeing the big picture, that I myself as a medical student had missed the big picture. I'd memorized a bunch of details and I had lost focus on the bigger picture of the diseases I was studying. And eventually that, even as a teacher, and as a sort of the director of a course and interacting now with the medical students and also the people who are teaching, often the big picture gets lost. And so that's kind of what led me that's what created that desire to produce Pathoma. I do remember vividly, probably the straw that broke the camel's back was one day I was sitting in the lab with the medical students, and the medical students were asking me questions about lymphoma and leukemia. And I began to quickly appreciate that they just didn't understand the big picture. They were memorizing a bunch of details, but they didn't understand exactly what leukemia is and what a lymphoma actually is. I began to explain that oma is a mass, anemia is in the blood. Began to ask questions about what's carcinoma, what's melanoma, what's sarcoma. And again, it just became utterly clear that they just had missed some of the big picture. So at that point, I basically was walking back to my cubicle that time I was a resident, and I just started thinking in the back of my head, like, this is crazy. Like, we just spent months and months and months and months teaching these students, and they gave me a bunch of details and they memorized all these details, but they didn't appreciate the bigger picture. And are we missing something here? And I started thinking that, like, we've got these heavy, big textbooks that we learn around, but maybe somebody needs to write something that's just a bit broader outline of the bigger picture of what's going on, and integrating years 1 and 2 into the clinical presentation of disease in year 3. And that's what then led me to think about writing Pathoma. And that's exactly what kicked it off, because I went back to my cubicle and bought the domain name on that day. This was like June 2006. I got distracted a little bit for a few years because I got involved in some more research endeavors, but eventually was able to return back and then write Pathoma.
SubhanAllah, that is an incredible sequence of events. I see that the roundabout interest in science and medicine continued for pathology as well. And I know you recently had an interview with the MSA of Wayne State University School of Medicine, in which you went into a bit more detail about your switch to pathology, choosing to stay at the University of Chicago beyond residency, and the more intricate logistics of creating Pathoma. And for those interested, that video is available on YouTube. But pulling from that interview and putting it all together with what you've just said, it's such a beautiful story that I think highlights some very powerful concepts. Trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, hard work, having a strong sense of purpose, adaptability, and thoughtful reflection and deliberation. And really embodying these principles ultimately led you to create Pathoma, a resource we all love and benefit from today, alhamdulillah. And your journey really underscores the importance of inculcating these values in our own lives. And so, speaking of Pathoma, I wanted to ask you about something you wrote that I feel is so profound, but may have gone unnoticed by many students. So in the Fundamentals of Pathology textbook, at the very beginning, there's a page on which you wrote, "To my parents and each of my teachers, your sacrifice forms the foundation upon which our work is built." So could you please unpack that insightful statement for us?
Mhm. Well, maybe I'll say it this way. Let me just take a step back and just say that I think everybody on this call, one thing to appreciate is that we don't achieve anything except that there's a whole system that's in place to support us. None of us ever achieve anything except that we're part of a greater team. Now, sometimes that team might be your family. Sometimes that team might be your colleagues. Sometimes that team might be the hospital setting. Sometimes that team might be the city in which you live. Sometimes that team is the state in which you're present, meaning, the state in the United States in this case. Or it could even be the fact that you're just a member of humanity and everybody's contributing to something that allows you to be able to thrive. And this is for me, this is a constantly recurring theme in my life, meaning I'm always recognizing, or at least I try to remind myself and try to recognize that I am dependent and able to do what I do only because there's a whole bunch of people out there in the world that are doing what they do. Just a simple example, if you happen to drive to the hospital today or you drove to school today, obviously there had to be people who were involved in paving the roads. Or if you had to drive to, when you entered the school building, there's got to be people that put that building together and all of the amount of work that was necessary, from the design of the building to the maintenance of the building to the physical construction of the building. A whole bunch of people. We don't exist in a vacuum. We exist as part of a team of humanity. And we simply make one contribution among billions and billions of contributions that everybody's making. And maybe I would say that, that introductory paragraph, although it wasn't as eloquent as I could have been, was really meant to just highlight that broader principle. Now, parents, of course, I think that's an obvious one. Our parents gave birth to us, raised us, supported us, were there at so many times when we needed assistance, are probably the one place in the world where you can always kind of lean back and know that you got some support and someone's got your back. So that's a really, really unique circumstance and something that we should never forget. But I would like, perhaps, again, as I said just a moment ago, to just impress that we're really dependents. We're dependent on a whole team of humanity. And part of the humbling nature of how we serve others is to recognize that we're actually part of that greater team. And that, number one, if we achieve something, it's only because the entire team contributed. And number two, we're there to support the other members of our team just as they support us at certain times in our lives. And that's really what makes it ultimately makes a physician. Someone who appreciates the team that they are present in and appreciates that it's an opportunity to serve the greater team that has been serving us throughout our lives.
That's such a beautiful reminder that you're encouraging us to recognize the team around us, identify the least obvious contributors, and appreciate the subtle blessings that support us as we continue to strive for excellence. So thank you for sharing that perspective. This idea of teamwork and mutual support naturally leads to another theme I see in the chat questions here, which I'll categorize as maximizing impact. So the summarized question would then be, as future healthcare professionals, what is the best way for us to maximize our impact on our Muslim communities?
Okay, well, let me just say that I think let's separate two things here. So let's take a step back. The way I view this is that my religion and my faith is my core that informs me as to how I can view the world around me and maintain myself in a way that I can contribute to that world around. So let's say it informs my worldview and how I can participate in that world. I don't see the expression of that as particularly religious. I think that, yes, there's some religious expression. For example, I offer prayers, I give charity, I fast in the month of Ramadan, etc. But my goal, we're not planning out there. My goal is to just go out and serve in every single capacity that I can towards all of humanity. Now, at times, that's going to be different. It's going to be facing different groups. So, for example, when I'm at the hospital, I'm at work, I'm working with the residents that are there. I'm working with the medical students. I'm working with the attendings. I'm working with the patients that come. And that's, for me, just the broadest expression of my contribution to humanity as a whole. And honestly, that takes up the vast majority of my day. I don't want to say it's the vast majority. It's much of my day. And then separately, I'm making a contribution to my family when I'm with my kids, when I'm with my wife, when I'm at home, when I'm with my relatives. And then beyond that, I'm making a contribution locally to my community. And, that contribution is going to vary. Each person's going to make a different contribution based on their circumstance. Now, I happen to be somebody that had the opportunity to spend time studying abroad. So, I have some background domain knowledge that allows me to be able to make a contribution in that way. I have a skill set that I gain by being in a professional environment. I'm at the university. I sit in the meetings. I see how the university functions. I'm at the University of Chicago, which is this major international institution, which allows me to see how they achieve what they achieve. And I'm able to take some of the learning that I gained there, the professionalism and the degree of excellence that they exhibit. And I try to bring that into what I do through Sacred Learning, which is the organization that I'm involved with, and the center that we have here locally, which really just serves international people, but has a local component to it as well. So, here I am basically taking who I am and then expressing that in so many different arenas. And I would just argue that all of you need to do the same thing. And by the way, if you ask me for one piece of advice on this, I would say, be yourself. The biggest deception in life, which happens to all of us, by the way, is that we often think about being somebody who we're not. And I'll give you a very simple example that all of you can relate to. So, one of the things that we like to do when we're studying for step one is we like to look over the shoulder and see what everybody else is studying. Like, oh my God, they studied for 3 months, or they studied this book, or they studied for these hours. And then we think that we have to do what they do. But we don't have to be them. We have to be ourselves. The goal in life is to recognize our own strengths and weaknesses, leverage our strengths, mitigate our weaknesses, and then achieve our goals based on who we are and not based on who someone else is. And that's a very, very big lesson to learn in life, to be comfortable in my own skin, to recognize myself, and to figure out how I'm going to make my contributions. That doesn't mean they're going to be your contributions. It means it's going to be my contributions. It means that I'm unique. So this is a very, very difficult thing for anyone to grasp. And I think, as people who are using our faith to strengthen our core, that's part of who we are. And it's probably one of the hardest things to come to terms with. Who am I? What am I trying to achieve? And how am I going to achieve that in a way that allows me to be as productive and as successful as possible?
Those are certainly words for us to live by, that by recognizing our unique strengths and aligning our contributions with those strengths, we can serve authentically and effectively, inshallah. And we learned that implementing this concept resulted in your unique contributions, one of which is Pathoma, which subsequently had an impact on all of us. And I think mentors can help in identifying our unique strengths. So connecting the theme of impact with mentorship, can you talk about how your mentors had an impact on you in general and on your medical career?
Yeah. So I'll just tell you that this is like a key thing for me. I think, so much of who we are and what we become is really dependent on mentorship. So I'm a big proponent, as is anybody in any academic setting, but I'm a big proponent of everybody needs a mentor, and everybody needs, if anyone can find, if you find one, you really need to appreciate the opportunity. I can tell you that I'll just trace a little bit of my own history and just tell you how important mentors were. So, for example, I grew up. I'll just tell you that I grew up in a, I wouldn't say that Islam was necessarily, or my religion was necessarily the first thing on everybody's mind. I grew up in a family that had immigrated from that had come from Pakistan, and they were trying to establish themselves. And it wasn't really the first thing. Now, it was, a practicing family, but it wasn't really the first thing on the list. The first thing on the list was to establish themselves and have their sort of kids establish themselves. And it was really in college that eventually I can say that there was an awakening, and I began to sort of appreciate my faith and the fact that I needed to be more serious about it. And so, you become part of an MSA, and I can tell you that if I trace back and think about my MSA days in college, I remember there were a bunch of us that were all really excited about our faith, really excited about the things that we were going to do and achieve, and it really got most important for us. And all of a sudden, you saw over time that many of those individuals, they slowly lost interest, and they did not necessarily become who they hoped they would be. And there were a few of us who went on to really develop ourselves, and I hope over the long term we'll be able to make contributions. And I ask myself, what's the difference? Like, why did everybody start the same, but some people were able to achieve so much more? And it really boils down to mentorship. I was at a very early age, I was put in the company of people who I respect and who were really interested in developing me. And I developed those connections, early on. And those were the people that eventually, those connections are what motivated me and allowed me to be able to achieve most of my goals, actually. And this principle, is not only something that I, place value with from a faith perspective, but also even from a medical perspective. I can tell you that I have mentors around me that remind me of what's important. I could tell you when I was finishing residency, I was certain I was going into private practice, but I eventually ended up in an academic environment because of my mentor. There were many, many twists and turns that occurred in my professional career. All of them were eventually, guided and, navigated through the help of my mentor. So I put a strong emphasis on just keeping people around you that can tell you about yourself when you can't necessarily see everything. Often in life we get caught up in our circumstance and we're not able to see the bigger picture. So it's nice to have people around you that you can trust, that know you, that will advise you based on you, and that will help you to achieve your goals. Now, that's really difficult to find, by the way. It's easy to find people that will tell you what to do. Everybody in the world has something to say about what you should do, but usually they speak from their own perspective, meaning they're telling you what they would do if they were you. They're not telling you what you should do, being you. So it's really hard in life to be able to find those types of individuals. And if you find them, I just recommend that you value them, develop your relationship with them, maintain your connection with them, and recognize that it's like gold. It's gold in the mine of working through how you're going to progress through life.
SubhanAllah. The importance of having people around us who can help us see the bigger picture and guide us based on our strengths and aspirations rather than their own perspectives is a lesson we can carry forward, not just in medicine, where we may become the future mentors to the next generation of med students and physicians, but really in every aspect of life. And so I see an interesting theme in the chat questions that connects the themes of mentorship, wellness, and personal growth. So you mentioned the importance of understanding ourselves to maximize our impact. And you've touched on how wellness is key to being a good physician. So as our unofficial mentor, can you help bring these ideas together by advising us on how we can stay true to ourselves, grow our character, and persevere through the inevitable struggles of our careers?
So this is the biggest challenge being a physician. Everybody starts bright-eyed, bushy tails, and everybody kind of has this intention to serve the world. But I think very quickly, unfortunately, the realities of life catch up to us and we lose focus on what our original goals were. It's just unfortunate, but it's the reality of how life works. You start out with an intention and then sometimes you end up where you never thought you would be, in the sense that you end up very, very far from what the initial intent was. And of course, there's distractions in life. There's wealth, there's status, there's fatigue, there's stress, there's family. All these things eventually take you away from the goal of being the best public servant being the best public servants that we can be. So, everybody, my advice to everybody on this call would be that it's important to have something that grounds you. Now, what that is, each person can determine for themselves, whether that's going to be faith or whether that's going to be wellness or whether that's going to be meditation or whether that's going to be, a combination of the above. And I'm just giving a few examples here. But I think everybody in this call needs to just appreciate that there's got to be something that's going to remind you of who you are and the dark days and at the difficult moments, and as you navigate through this non-linear path of life, right? Life has twists and turns and convolutions and complications, and you always need to figure out how you're going to navigate those. So it's really, really exceedingly important to keep people in your life that are going to remind you of who you are, and to give the appropriate emphasis so that you always sort of keep a light on, so that you can always find your way home when you need to. And so, for me personally, that occurs through a very deep spiritual practice. I put a lot of emphasis on, part of my training abroad was not only academic, but, I would argue that perhaps for me, one of the most important aspects of my training abroad was that I spent a lot of time working on myself spiritually. And yes, I spent time reading books and doing academic things in my faith, but also a lot of time working on myself spiritually. In fact, that's really the thing that drove me to study abroad. For me, that's the core. That's what grounds me. It's what allows me to reset, remember who I am, remember why I do what I do, help me to navigate some of the difficult things that are going to arise as challenges in how I make decisions about how I spend my time, how I spend where my focus is, reminding me to serve others, reminding me to have respect for everyone on our team of humanity, etc. So that's what drives me. I would just say to you that just because you're bright-eyed, bushy-tailed today and you've got all these great aspirations and intentions doesn't mean you're going to necessarily be able to achieve them without necessarily, because this is a long road. It's not a race, it's a marathon, and it doesn't happen in a year. It happens over decades. So, just a reminder to myself and everyone that it's important to have the things in life that balance you. I would even argue, write yourself a note today and of who you hope to be 30 years from now, and open it up in 15 years and see whether you're halfway there or not. It might be shocking that, I intended to be this, and how did I become that? So I would just, again, remind everyone on this call that you got to have something that centers you and grounds you.
Your words reminded me of something from med school orientation, which is to always remember our why. And your advice really brings that idea to life, showing how our why is as vital as our academic and professional pursuits, and how this not only serves as a compass for when we feel lost or distracted by life's complexities, but also as a means of growth through perseverance. And so, building on this, I noticed some interesting comments in the chat that I'd like to tie together with the themes that we've discussed, like wellness, staying true to ourselves, impact, mentorship, and being grounded. So the summarized question I'd like to pose is, how do you determine if the field you are pursuing is something that you're truly passionate about, or if that passion is something that can be developed under the guidance of mentors in that field.
So my advice on medical fields would be that you got to do what you enjoy. And you can't worry about what everybody else is telling you. So this is a really long path. When you get into medicine, by the way, let me just take a step back. A lot of times people get into medicine and they keep a counter. So they start medical school and then they say, well, I got 4 years of medical school, I got 3 years of residency, and then I'm going to be maybe a year of fellowship, and then I'm going to be practicing. And it could extend up to 5 or 7 years of residency, et cetera. I think that the day you start medical school, you need to put that calculator away. You got to just put away the calendar. The reason that you're going to medical school is because you love medicine, you love humanity, you want to serve medicine, you want to serve humanity through that knowledge of medicine. And if you have a faith-based approach, then you're using this as an expression of the gratitude for what you've been given in order to be able to return something with a hope of a reward. Okay? So there's no counting anymore. What are you counting? The days are going to pass anyway. There's no 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, 10 year, 20 year. You just need to stop counting, and instead you need to just focus on enjoying what you're doing rather than worrying about how much time is left or what am I going to do next. And that means that you take advantage of every opportunity that's before you. So as a first and second year medical student, my number one piece of advice is to be first and second year medical students. Don't go around and start picking up random subjects and reading about them and thinking, well, now today I'm going to study the, explication of the Quran. That's a distraction at that point, right? First 2 years of medical school is your time to dedicate to medicine. If you're going to do something that's going to take you away from medicine, the intention is to reset yourself, not to do something different. So if you went to read something that you are interested in outside of medicine, the goal there is not that you're going to study some other subject, but rather that you're going to just reset yourself so that you can be energized towards medicine. So I think that's the first step when you're first and second year. When you're a third, fourth year, now you're making this immense transition from classroom to clinic. I don't think we appreciate how immense that is, but think about it. You've been in the classroom from kindergarten all the way to second year. And all of a sudden, your whole life changes in third year when you now go to clinic. You're no longer in a classroom anymore. So it's a completely different mindset. And there you need to maintain yourself and learn as much as you can, recognizing that you're going to be overwhelmed in the first couple of years because you're new. You're a kindergartner in college, right? Because you've never been in the clinics before. It's a new thing. So it's okay to not know. It's okay to be fatigued. It's okay to be confused. It's okay to question. But you should appreciate every rotation as an opportunity to really learn and ascertain whether you're going to go into that field or not. And then the next step is you get to be a resident, and that's an amazing opportunity to be able to develop that domain knowledge that you need in order to be able to achieve your goals of service and in an area that you desire to serve it. And all of that's going to be, part and parcel with the fact that you're going to be maintaining yourself throughout this entire process, religiously, spiritually, wellness, etc. And that's how you have to progress through that. So I wouldn't worry about time. I would worry about what you love. I would recognize that the day you enter med school, the clock stops. You're going to be doing this for the next 40 years. Don't worry about how long something's going to take. Train as long as you would like to. I would even argue the longer you can train, the better. And the more fellowships you do, the better. Personally, when I advise people, I advise them to do up to 2 and 3 fellowships. I think it's the rare time in life where you can actually gain a tremendous amount of specialized knowledge that's going to strengthen you throughout your careers. And then over time, as you become established in your career, let's say, 2-3 years into practice, you'll then have the ability to be able to do so many other things that are outside of medicine because you will have made medicine second nature to you. And that's the time where you can begin to explore other opportunities, whether that's going to be social work or developing yourself in the knowledge of your faith, etc. So that's kind of how I view the broader sequence and how I usually advise people who I'm mentoring.
Your advice serves as a powerful reminder to perceive each stage of this journey, whether that be rotations, residency, fellowship, and even eventual practice, not as hurdles, but as privileges and opportunities to grow. And what I'm taking away from your advice is the importance of balancing focus with appropriate resetting and re-energizing as needed, and the importance of viewing this path with gratitude and immersing ourselves in the process of becoming better healers and servants to humanity. And so I'm seeing a lot of comments and questions that can be categorized into themes of Islam, family, and career. So I'll try to tie them together and summarize them into one question as best as I can. I don't mean to ignore or skip anyone's questions, but I also want to make sure that we get through as many questions and as many themes as possible. So as Muslims in the healthcare field, the three most important things in life are our faith, our families, and our careers. How do we balance all three while maintaining and improving upon them? I'm sorry if I didn't do a good job framing the question.
No, actually, it's interesting. Why don't I just say this? We're so fortunate. For those who have a system or a paradigm, we're fortunate that we can just live according to that paradigm and be very confident that we're going to be successful in all the domains that you described. I don't need to wake up in the morning and try to figure out how I'm going to fit all the pieces together. Personally, I'm speaking personally, and for someone on the call that may, still be searching for how they're going to establish themselves, then maybe it's not as easy. But for me, I can tell you, I don't wake up in the morning wondering what I need to do and what's the best way to do it. I know what I need to do. I know that in order to maintain my faith, I have some mandates, and those mandates are going to allow me to always keep that light of spirituality alive in my heart. So, I put a huge premium on the 5 prayers because they're essential. They're not extra. It's like a meal, right? I mean, I have to have those 5 prayers in my day in order to just preserve myself. And so I'm very particular about doing those prayers properly, making sure that I'm in a proper state of mind and purity when I do them, not rushing through them, granting the appropriate time that's necessary for them. Because if you don't let the prayers express themselves through you, then you will have lost out on the number one or one of the key nutrients, right? If you're not eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, why do you want to talk about what vitamins you should eat? I mean, we got to start with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And breakfast, lunch, and dinner for us is 5 prayers in a day. That's for those following the Islamic tradition. That's our core. That's our spine. That's our backbone. So it starts there. And then, how I deal with my wealth. I know how I need to deal with my wealth. It's not a challenge. Yes, it might be a challenge to live up to it, but I already have a paradigm. How do I deal with the world around me? How do I incorporate family? How do I decide when there's 50 options in front of me? How do I decide what's best at any particular moment and any particular place in time? So much of that work is already done for me. So I actually find this question to be the easiest question, not the hardest question, because if I simply understand my faith, then my paradigm's already established and I can be comfortable in knowing that I can follow that paradigm and be relatively successful. Now, if I don't have that, then you got to find someone who you can respect, who you feel has an appropriate balance and can be a model for you. For me, I have that. I have that in the Prophet of Islam, peace and blessings be upon him, who provides me with a model, and I can follow that model, and I can be comfortable that I'm balancing everything appropriately. How do I balance my children? How do I balance my time in prayer? How do I balance my excellence at work? How do I balance how I use my wealth? All these things, I have major principles that guide me. I don't need to reinvent the wheel. And so for me, that's just very comforting, and that's pretty much how I try to design my day. I always ask the question, what is mandatory, what's necessary, what's extra, and then based on that, I'll sort of like move the pieces around based on the circumstances that I find myself in throughout the week or throughout the year or throughout the month.
SubhanAllah. For the Muslims in the audience, it's truly uplifting to realize that Islam provides us with a timeless framework for guidance, balance, and growth, and that this framework was perfectly embodied in the life of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him. And the challenge now lies in tapping into it with sincerity and consistency to bring balance and fulfillment in our lives. And that takes care of most of the chat questions for now. So if anyone has any additional questions or wants clarification, or if I happen to skip your question, you can either click on the raise your hand feature and I'll call on you, or you can type it in the chat and I can read it out for you. Okay. I see a few hands raised. Let's go with Waqas Haq.
Husain Abdul Sattar, thanks for doing this call again. I'm just really brief. Just curious, you can kind of comment on just some of the main differences you saw in like learning tradition between Islam and medicine. Maybe some things you saw like in terms of crossing over, learning and teaching methods, and maybe like how you applied that when you wrote the Doha.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would tell you that there's no doubt that my Islamic learning had a huge effect on how I view learning as a whole, and in particular how I developed Pathoma. So I can tell you that just as an example, one of my mentors in my faith learning was someone who had just this uncanny ability to, number one, take large amounts of knowledge and to funnel them down into very simple concepts, and number two, to be able to teach that with a passion. And it's interesting. I've spent so much time in so many amazing institutions throughout the world, and I learned this from this one teacher in a village, essentially. But that of course informed the way that I teach, informed the way that I look at things. I would even say to you, that how do I view the world? So for me, the way I view the world is that the world is this sort of like maze of multiplicity, where you're interacting with so many things, and you view the world around you, and for me, that all funnels into, one creator who created everything, and that's how I view all of the multiplicity of everything. When I see something, it's a sign of that creator. When something happens, it was from that creator, etc. And so I think that is a unifying theme for me, how I deal with life. And it's also a unifying principle for me. I'll just say that it drives me to sort of try to look at things when they appear to be complicated and disparate, and try to seek a common thread, just like I do in the world around me. So yes, I mean, many of the features that I gained from my faith studies eventually pour over into my medical teaching and my medical studies. And honestly, I would even argue the other way around. So much of the science that I spent my time learning and deciphering and understanding has a huge impact on the way that I even view religion. So, to me, one of the greatest motivators and reminders of the central role of my faith is the nature of science, and how everything just is so coordinated, and everything is just so perfectly intertwined, and how no matter where you look, you find order out of chaos. And honestly, we could have a whole separate talk about this topic, but just the fact that there's order in every chaos, what is seemingly chaotic, for me is a huge feature of how I view the world. And so it's this yin and yang. My religion affects the way I view medicine, but my understanding of science and medicine affects the way that I view religion. And over time, I was able to bring those two things together. It took decades, but so I would say yes, both of these two features are always playing off one another in everything that I do.
your response beautifully illustrates how our understanding of Islam and medicine can inform and enrich one another. Alhamdulillah. And I think that's a key takeaway for us, especially in this day and age. All right. Next question from Saba Suleiman.
Assalamualaikum. I just had a quick question about, do you have any recommendations for resources that give the Islamic perspective on medical ethics? And where specifically, where I'm in my medical ethics course right now, I'm learning about things like abortion and organ donation, and I just would like to know the Islamic perspective on that as well, and like have that going into practice. Do you know of any resources or anything that can help provide that?
Yeah, so I don't personally know of a singular resource that would allow you to gain, the key knowledge in this field. I would just remind you that it's in order to be able to truly develop an understanding of any field, you need experts in that field along with practitioners in that field. So what you're really looking for is a environment or a circumstance in which people on the ground, physicians, are able to consult with people in the ivory towers, who in this case would be scholars of the Islamic tradition. And that's really rare to find. Now, it may not necessarily be practical, because if you think about it, I'm not sure that those ethical implications would apply to the vast majority of people that you're interacting with. Sure, there might be an individual on occasion who would approach you and say, I need a faith-based answer to an ethical dilemma. But unless you're practicing in an environment where you're dealing with people who are seeking that type of information, it probably isn't relevant to the vast majority of patients that you treat. So it's going to be a relatively small subset of people that would be particularly interested in what that view might be. I can tell you, and I haven't explored this enough, so I just giving off a possibility from the top of my head. We used to have a individual, Dr. Asim Padella, who was at the University of Chicago. I think he's now moved on to the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, if I recall correctly. And he was particularly interested in bioethics, and he was someone that would explore these two things and has made some contributions in this field. So you may want to look him up, and eventually that may help you to find a more robust environment where you could ask these questions.
And thank you so much.
Okay, we'll go to Hashir Mohiuddin.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for doing this. Really appreciate it. As you already stated that Islam is a core of your life, and you let the decisions that you make go around that. And alhamdulillah, we have Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam as our example of how to carry our life. So in addition to that, basically going off that, how does one not let medicine, which is an obviously arduous and time-consuming field, and overtake your Islamic practice? Additionally, how does one balance learning deed while in the field? And obviously, Islam is a lifestyle, it's not a side hustle. So if you could, please help us with this. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, I think this all boils down to, again, a couple things. Number one, having a routine, right? Which is, for example, you set the time that you have, that you're dedicating to medicine. You set the time that you're dedicating to your own spiritual development. You set the time that you're dedicating to your family, and you be strict about those things. I'm exceedingly strict about those things. When I'm at work, I'm not, I try to do work, and when I'm at home, I try to be home. And when I'm at the learning center or, a masjid, I try to be at the masjid. So I try to create barriers and walls and try to divide these things out. Now, of course, that's not always going to be perfect. It's more difficult. It's more easy to say than do, but at least I try to start there. And then I think the other thing is important, again, to have mentors and dedicated places where you're going to develop yourself. So, I'm fortunate to have had the opportunity to be able to spend time with a lot of different righteous people. And when I feel that I need to reset myself, I go and put myself in the environments where I can do that. So I'll visit teachers, I'll visit certain places, in order to reset and try to achieve a greater balance. So I don't think there's a, like a one size fits all, very easy, straightforward answer to your question, except maintain your core, and your core is already established in these 5 pillars that we have. And then find environments where you can commit yourself and reset yourself on occasion. So, find a local masjid, for example, where you can do that. Find someplace nationally or internationally where on occasion you can show up and be inspired religiously. Find places where you can be inspired medically as well, by the way. And that will, I think, over time help you to be able to achieve your goals.
Jazakallah khair.
Alhamdulillah. We learned from your advice that establishing our core principles, setting efficient boundaries, and seeking environments and mentors that inspire and reset us are all key components that will enable us to find the balance and growth we seek in life. And so, in light of the residency match coming up, there are some interesting thoughts and questions in the chat that I would categorize into themes of disappointment, burnout, and disinterest. So, in tying all those themes together, the summarized question I'd ask is, what advice do you have for those who face disappointment in medicine or other healthcare specialties, whether it's not matching into their desired specialty, falling into a backup specialty, or experiencing burnout and a loss of interest?
Okay, sure. So let's take a step back. Everything in life doesn't go exactly the way we want it to go. And for those who are looking at the world through this faith-based lens, we're not in the driver's seat, we're in the passenger seat. And we're content with whatever Allah decrees. Now, this whole concept of decree and qadar, is a complicated and lengthy conversation. Again, that would be a separate 1-hour lecture. I'd say that, at this point, we do what we can. We make our best effort. And one of the things that brings tremendous peace to our hearts is that we know in the end, whatever happened is what Allah deemed to be best. So that's how I view the circumstances that arise. Now, we tend to get fixated on me and I need and I want. But remember that we exist in a much greater context of a reality of a universe. I mean, I end up in, for example, I apply to specialty A and I don't match, and I end up in specialty B. A couple things to appreciate. Number one, I'm still going to have the opportunity to serve patients, and any opportunity to serve patients is amazing and something that's we should be proud of and excited about. Maybe it wasn't exactly what I was looking for, but it's still an opportunity. I mean, I kind of view this as a difference between strawberry and vanilla ice cream. Both are ice creams. Maybe they ran out of vanilla, so you'll take strawberry. Number one. Number two, no path is a dead end, meaning every path has the opportunity to move to another path. I can't tell you the countless number of people who I know who ended up doing one specialty and then switch after a year or two, and that can always be done. So that's important to recognize. You should never see one opportunity as an end. It's simply one opportunity opens the door to the next one. So that would be another issue related to matching. And I just, in general in life, recognize that I don't control the world. I control only what's immediately in front of me, and I try to make the best out of every situation that arises in life. And that's what brings contentment and peace to a person's heart. So rather than try to force a square into a circle, like those little pegs you used to play with when you were in kindergarten, where the circle has to go into the circle and the square has to go into the square, rather than try to force the square into a circle, I would simply be content with what happens and then look at how I can make the best of what's in front of me rather than worrying about the past. So this is how I would deal with the natural disappointment that arises when things don't work exactly the way that we hope that they would work. And by the way, I'm not discounting their emotions that we have. Of course, we invest a lot of time, energy, money, effort into things working the way that we want them to work. And of course, there's going to be letdown in that process, right? We wouldn't care so much if we didn't put so much into it. So it is a natural consequence of having worked so hard and invested so much that we want things to go our way. And in fact, that's a good feeling. It's what drives us towards excellence. But the nice thing about having a faith-based perspective is we can also be confident that after we made every effort, that Allah was the one that wrote what he wrote and that was what was best for us in the end. So this is the nice feature of, having that perspective. And then finally, how do I remain motivated? Yes, that is a very, very difficult question. And it really requires balance. It requires again, I can't stop coming back to this mentorship issue, but it requires knowing when to step away, knowing when to apply yourself, knowing when to go further, knowing when to change directions. As a general rule, I'll tell you that one of the advisors told me that you should never do anything for more than 5 years. And I think that's a really, really good piece of advice. So for example, if you're in a practice and you've been there for 5 years, and if you start feeling yourself getting burned out, it's probably time to switch to another practice. Maybe it's time to switch what you do in that practice. Maybe you're doing more teaching. Maybe you do a little more patient care. Maybe you're doing a little more patient care. Maybe you do a little more management. So you always need to mix things up. We're human beings. We're not able to do the same thing consistently for decades on end. There does need to be something unique, something new, something that excites us. And so it's really important to appreciate that every few years, it's good to mix things up a little bit, even if it means taking like 3 months off and just traveling the world to reset. That can be very healthy. Maybe you sacrifice 3 months, but you're able to maintain your career over years and years because you did that small sacrifice. So, it's hard to answer this question more specifically than that because everybody's circumstance is different. But, I would say, number one, work hard. Number two, be grateful for what you're able to do and achieve. Always see it as an opportunity. Mix things up on occasion to keep yourself fresh and excited. And these are some of the things that will hopefully help you to achieve those goals.
Thank you for that, Dr. Abdul Sattar. Your advice eloquently ties together some of the previous concepts we've discussed, particularly trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, gratitude, adaptability, servitude, doing our absolute best, and maintaining wellness. And so I see a theme in the chat about medical education. So I'll frame the question as follows. Given your background, what are your thoughts on medical education today? You've mentioned that a big problem with medical education is focusing too much on the pixel and losing sight of the bigger picture. So do you think medical education needs to change to help students better understand concepts and build a stronger knowledge base for their lifelong careers in healthcare?
Again, separate 1 hour lecture, but I'll just say that let's start by just asking a simple question, which is, what is the goal of medical education? Like, as a individual who's thinking about medical education, what is the goal? What are we trying to achieve? And I would say that you're trying to achieve a few things. So goal number one in medical education is to educate individuals in the basic sciences so that they can take those basic sciences and apply them to human disease and alleviate suffering and have concern and care for humanity. So this is goal one. But there's additional goals as well. Goal number two in medicine is to inspire you to investigate so that you can advance the science of medicine. So you need that as part of medicine. Goal number three is to inspire you to a service of humanity so that you don't lose the core of what you're trying to achieve. Goal number four is to inspire you to a love of learning throughout life, because medicine is not a 1 or 2 year endeavor. It's a decades long endeavor. And so we've got a myriad of goals. Goal number five, I don't even know what number I'm on. Goal number five, if that's the number, is to create an environment of like-minded individuals who are all striving so that we can achieve goals 1 through 4, because nobody achieves anything in a box. You got to be in an environment. We live in communities, we form communities, and it's communities that allow us to thrive. So, why do you go to medical school? You could technically read all the books at home. The reason you go to medical school is because there's an environment of like-minded individuals who are all striving. There's a curriculum that's developed, and you're brought in the company of a bunch of professors who are all motivated, who are also striving. So we all benefit from one another by creating an environment that's conducive to achieving the goals of medicine. So all of these are important facets of what the goals of medical education are. And sometimes we lose sight of that. We think the goal of medical education is step one. No, that is not. The step one is just an unfortunate consequence of medical education, which is present in order to ensure that you reach some sort of basic degree of competency. But I wouldn't say that the goal of medicine has anything to do with step one. So look, for example, the ability to be able to gather together as a bunch of students all seeking medical knowledge and be inspired by one another is really important. I know it's, you're in the middle of medical school, you're thinking, why do I have to go to class? But that's what class provides, right? Similarly, if no one shows up to class, why would the teachers be motivated to teach? So again, you need to appreciate that aspect of medicine. The love of learning and the desire to continuously learn and ask questions and investigate is absolutely necessary. Otherwise, we'd be practicing medicine from 50 years ago, and it would be probably malpractice, right? Because it's the advancements that we make in medicine that allow us to best serve our patients. So these are all important features of medical education, and it's not solved by a bunch of videos on pathology that help make your broad-based understanding of pathology better. I just serve one role through that. But I would never, ever make the assumption that somehow that could replace medicine or replace medical education. I'm adding a piece to a greater puzzle of what medical education can be. Now, my hope is that through Pathoma, individuals will basically take a broad stroke of what is basic sciences vis-a-vis treatment of patients clinically, and that you'll file those things away to help you develop a lifelong love of learning. And you'll build on these concepts that I'm presenting to you, recognizing that Pathoma is not an end, it's the beginning to a longer journey, which will never end. And so I appreciate the question that you're asking me, which is that, given Pathoma and given my background and given all these students that I interact with, how would I change medical education? But I would just say that this is a big boat. It's a big ship. And it's been moving in the right direction for centuries. So we're not necessarily trying to shift it. We're just trying to fine-tune it.
Jazakallahu khair. I think your video might have gotten cut out again, but it's not a problem, inshallah. We can hear you perfectly. And I know Maghrib prayer time is coming in soon in Chicago. So is it okay if we ask 2 or 3 more questions before we wrap up?
Oh, yeah, no problem.
Okay, perfect. I see a couple more hands raised. Let's go with Iram Sayed.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much to Dr. Sattar and the host for setting this up. So many amazing gems by Dr. Sattar, and really, really love the summaries and reflections by the host too. So I wanted to ask, I've been looking into spiritual purification, when I'm not swamped with so many med school exams all the time. So was just wondering if you could talk about what it means to have a sound heart from a spiritual perspective.
Sure. So, let's take a step back and just understand that, human beings are obviously comprised of, 2 components. We have a body, which is a physical body, which honestly, we're all aware is a vehicle. We sort of get this vehicle in an early stage of embryogenesis, eventually becomes a child, and it grows up into an adult. And then eventually we pass through this world, and this vehicle will be disintegrated and will return back from the same earth from which it was derived. And then the more important is the passenger, which is the soul. And the soul is where the essence lies. Now, the heart is an interesting organ medically and spiritually, because the heart actually kind of plays a dual role. It happens to be a core organ of the body because it pumps blood throughout the body, but it also happens to be a core area of the soul because it's the It's the sort of spiritual essence of a human being as well. And I think that the vast majority of us appreciate that. We understand that. But the challenge lies in maintaining the health of the spiritual heart. And if we want to ask, the first question is, what is my state? Where am I at? And the answer to that question is, if you took your heart and you squeezed it like you would like an orange, and you asked what would come out of it, then you will get a very quick assertion of where our hearts are. When you squeeze an orange, you would expect orange juice to come out. If I could go, the only one that could dive into my heart is myself. So if I dive into my heart and I see that it's full of envy, lust, greed, filth, and if we were to take my heart and squeeze it and see what would come out, it would be significant filth. Then that's a problem. That is not a sound heart. Whereas if I find my heart is full of love, light, goodness, I'm at peace with myself. I'm at peace with the world around me. I'm at peace with my akhirah. I'm at peace with how I'm engaging with dunya. Then that's a sound heart. And how you achieve that, that's another question. But I think we should start by just saying that this is a question that all of us must ask. So just from a physical realm, as you're aware, like our biggest problem is that patients don't appreciate that they have a problem until it's too late. I don't want to say too late, but until it's late. And you'll see that so much of medicine emphasizes the screening of a patient in order to be able to determine that a disease process exists far before it presents itself clinically. And I think, we're the same way. We don't want our hearts to present at the time that we're having a spiritual, quote unquote, heart attack or an MI. We want to screen our hearts and ask the question, is my heart ready to be presented to Allah? And the answer to that is that if you just, the reality of that is we just took the heart and we squeezed it. Just ask what would come out.
Okay, thank you.
May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability of introspection, which allows us to obtain sound hearts that He is pleased with. Ameen. Okay, next question from Zaina Bishawi.
Assalamu alaikum. Just want to say thanks so much for doing this. Definitely echo what the last person said about gems and the summaries and stuff. Really phenomenal job by the host. Absolutely loving it. My question is kind of going off the last question. We've been doing cardiac pathology in my med school block right now. So this question has been like in the back of my mind for the longest time. So can you comment on what Islam teaches us about the effect of sin on the heart, and if we can make it go back to its original state or its original form of the heart?
Sure. So, as we're aware, every sin leads to a black mark or dot on the heart. And eventually, over time, that can lead to a sealing of the heart. So let's say that sin in general and disobedience as well will lead to staining of the heart. And it's our responsibility to maintain a pure and clean heart. Now, I just want to say one thing here, which is that another important feature to understand, and I see this coming up in the chat as well, and so maybe I can just kind of like prophylactically answer this question, is that one of the unique aspects of the heart, the spiritual heart, is that it's not absorbing. It's impermeable. What I mean by that is that let's say you have a piece of clothing and you kind of get it dirty. I don't know, you're eating something with ketchup or, something that has a deep staining quality. When you eventually wash that clothing, usually you can see the residual stain. You'll be able to know that, well, there was something here and I washed it away and I've 90% removed, but there's 10% that's present. But the staining of the heart is a little different. It can be completely wiped away with no residue. because stain is not inherent. Those stains are not inherent to the human. They're external, meaning there's this beautiful heart. We're essentially given this pure heart at birth, and we stain it over time. But if a person desires to remove those stains, I don't want to use the word stains, we impurify it over time. And if a person desires to remove those impurities, it's very easily done. And the result is such that it can be completely eliminated, such that the entire effect of that can be removed. So it's one of the very beautiful aspects of purification in our deen, is that it's so empowering that it just completely resets a person back to their original state. Because they're external, they're not staining, they don't become inherently intertwined with the individual. And spiritual progress, purification of the heart is one dimension of that. So let's just say spiritual progress, purification of the heart, etc. It occurs through the removal of the negative more than the emphasizing the positive. Let's give an example. Another term that you come across a lot is tazkiyah, which would be the term, for spiritual development, a Quranic term for spiritual development. And when you think about the word tazkiyah, it has, a few important connotations. So the one connotation that everyone can appreciate is this connotation of purification. And the word tazkiyah has a connotation to purify something. But another secondary connotation is growth. And when you do tazkiyah of something, which is, purification, it's a purification that results in growth. And there's a tertiary connotation. And the tertiary connotation is that growth reaches its pinnacle, that it reaches its desired perfection. So let's take a more common example for a moment. Going back to our basic pillars of our deen, this concept of zakah, which also, derives from this term tazkiyah. It says a similar kind of derivation in terms. When a person gives zakah, number one, one angle of it is that they purify their wealth. And that's why it's called zakah, because it's when a person takes 2.5% of their excess wealth and returns it back to those to whom it's deserved, it is a purification method for the wealth. But at the same time, that purification method of the wealth also leads to growth, in that when a person removes this amount of wealth from their excess savings, that will cause a growth in the wealth that remains behind, or allow for growth in the wealth. It creates space for growth in the wealth that remains behind. And eventually the notion is that there will be barakah in that growth, and that growth will grow and have barakah in it and will achieve a perfect form for the individual that possesses it. So with that analogy, now let's take that to the spiritual side and say that tazkiyah, or this notion of purification of the soul, the way by which it's going to occur is to first remove the impurities. If a person first removes the impurities, that will create the space for growth. And when that creates the space for growth, that will allow a person to reach their pinnacle, their individual pinnacle. Now, every person's different. We're not all going to be the same, but it'll allow for the person to reach their own individual pinnacle. So, see, the other thing is when you want to develop spiritually, the challenge isn't good deeds, because good deeds are already inherent in our deen. I would assume the people on this call, the audience is one that's already practicing. The 5 pillars of our deen and the basic understanding of the sunnah that the people on this call probably have is all inherently what you need it's all you need inherently in order to be able to grow spiritually. So spiritual development is not about standing in the middle of the night and praying all night, or sitting and reading Quran all day, or fasting every other day. Spiritual development is about removing the negative, removing the impurities. Because if a person removes the impurities, they will create the space that will allow the basic 5 pillars of our deen to create a very strong spiritual effect in a person. Salah has what we need. Zakah has what we need. Ramadan has what we need. It's a very spiritual, it's a very powerful spiritual prescription. Our problem is not that we don't do good deeds. We do tons of good deeds. Our problem is that we mix it with bad deeds. We mix it with things that are detrimental to our growth. And by mixing it with things that are detrimental for our growth, we stunt the power of the inherent nature of Islam. So, and, just as an example, the science of tasawwuf, some people call it tasawwuf, some people call it tazkiyah, some people call it Sufism. These are loaded terms, and I don't want to get into terminologies today. Each term has its own connotation depending on the time and place. But one of the terms that people have also used historically, and our scholars have historically used, is tawbah. That they just would use the term tawbah. And in fact, often if you were to approach a sheikh and ask, present yourself to the sheikh, say, here's my circumstance, I'm trying to improve myself spiritually, what would you recommend? I'd like to become a student. The common way by which the students would basically express their interest in developing under a sheikh would be to make a bay'ah of tawbah. And that is such a symbolic entry point, because it's that the tawbah, that bay'ah of tawbah, essentially what's happening in that bay'ah of tawbah is that there's an individual who's basically come to the appreciation that I need to develop myself spiritually, that I find a deficiency in myself. And the sheikh basically says, okay, the first step before we begin anything, before we even have any discussion, is going to be, obviously we can discuss what is development, but the first step in your development will be to make tawbah to Allah, to turn to Allah and seek forgiveness for all of the deficiencies that have existed, and to consistently seek istighfar moving forward. Because that is the challenge. Now, I would advise anyone who's trying to develop spiritually, there's a lot of ways to develop spiritually. There's over the counter, there's prescription. I'm going to speak medically. You don't necessarily need to go and find one particular sheikh and all of a sudden you're magically going to spiritually develop. That's not necessarily the paradigm. You need to be in good company. You need to sit in the company of people who will encourage you to thrive. You need to learn the deen, study the deen, sit in the good company of people who will guide you to goodness, etc. But a very, very important aspect of all of this is to ask myself the question, what am I doing that is detrimental to me? Then be utterly honest with oneself about what are the things that I'm partaking of on my daily routine that are just not good. Am I speaking too much? Am I looking at that which I shouldn't look at? Am I engaging myself in things that are just an utter waste of time and are taking me away from other than Allah? And by the way, these characteristics, these descriptors that I just used, these don't apply to career. I know we started this conversation with a discussion of career. These don't apply to career. They apply to what we do in our free time. But the point I want to make is concerning the question that was raised is that the battle in spiritual development always lies in removing the ill. In this day and age, it lies in removing the ill and asking ourselves the question, where am I disobeying? Because we're probably doing many of the good things that can allow us to achieve our goals. Maybe I'll just give one more analogy just to explain it. Let's say that there's a bathtub and you turn the water on and it's filling the bathtub, but you leave the drain open. So if you leave the drain open, no matter how much water is coming in, it's not going to collect, and you're never going to appreciate that your tub is full of water because the drain is left open. Sins are like the drain. If we leave it open, we can bring all this goodness, but we'll never really appreciate the goodness because it never builds. It just keeps going through the drain. And not that that's a positive thing. That is a positive thing. I'm not arguing that. But what I am arguing is that if we were to just make the effort to plug the drain, many of the things that we do would have a far deeper impact on ourselves spiritually. So I'm a big proponent, and this is what I've learned from my teachers, that the battle lies in avoiding sin and those things that are just disruptive to our spiritual development.
Thanks so much.
SubhanAllah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the strength to abstain from sin so that the beneficial effects of our good deeds accumulate, ultimately enabling us to purify our hearts and improve our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ameen. All right, so one final question, inshallah. I've been meaning to ask you, since we're talking about spiritual development, and we previously discussed how our understanding of Islam and medicine is synergistic, what are your thoughts on the misconception that faith and reason are diametrically opposed? So, as Muslims in healthcare, we learn all of this science and medicine, but rather than allowing that science to further strengthen our faith, if anything, we sometimes fall victim to having this worldview that removes faith and Allah. So, as someone who is surrounded by intellectuals at a world-class institution like the University of Chicago, could you please give us some advice on how we can preserve and strengthen our iman and tackle this big issue at large?
Oh yeah, you hit on the topic.
I'm sorry if this question is untimely.
Oh no, listen, this isn't that you just made hit on the topic of the day. This is the topic. I think that you hit on the topic of the day here, which is that, look, this is for me like a really big issue, honestly, because I feel really, really strongly that, see, the time and place, let's look at this contextually for a moment. The time and place in which we live is that we start at a very young age going to classes from age 5 or age 3 all the way until age 20, sometimes 30, in my case 30, when I graduated from med school. We're just used to class after class after class after class. And that's the paradigm in which we sort of are raised. Now you come to this notion where somewhere along the way, this idea of deen arises in the heart of an individual. You know, whether you're raised with it or whether it comes to you because you undergo certain circumstances in life. And the knee-jerk reaction is that this is also one more class. That somehow the deen is just like another class. Like, I'll do a sira, or I'll do a this, or I'll do a that, and that's somehow going to be deen. But the reality is that while those are essential for deen and highly beneficial, deen is not an academic exercise. Deen is a spiritual exercise. It is the transformation of the human soul to be completely in awe with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, such that awe is manifested in everything the person does. That is the core premise of our deen. It begins with La ilaha illallah. It returns to La ilaha illallah. We've come to this point where we've got all these people that are grown and born and raised in deen, and we've come to this point where we think that if we throw that information on them, they're supposed to come to the conclusion that there's only one God, Allah. There's no God but Allah, etc. And that's where we often get lost in translation. So you see, like, people feel the deen is very dry nowadays. You're just throwing a bunch of rules on me. You're just giving me a bunch of academically interesting things to think about and trying to wow me that way. But in the end, if it's devoid of this fundamental awe-inspiring notion of this creator that's beyond anything we can imagine and that has created everything around us in the most amazing way, and then how will we ever be able to? I would argue it's the other way. I would argue that Sharia is a manifestation of the love of Allah and what a person can do to further engage that Allah and to avoid ever displeasing that Allah. And if that's missing, then it becomes really, really difficult. Now, does that mean that we're devoid of knowledge? No, of course not. Knowledge, intellectual pursuits, academics is all going to be important, but it can't be divested of this whole premise of this spiritual experience that's called Islam. And yeah, I agree with you that when you want to there's two ways to make an argument about the truth of Islam. One is, here's academic point A, academic point B, academic point C. And those are essential. I'm not saying they're not necessary, especially in this day and age. We need to know our deen and we need to know how to defend it, etc. But I think that if you can get a person to just experience Allah, then many of the academic qualms go away, because in the end, the experience is so deep that you don't need to convince anybody beyond that. It's like me trying to convince you about how good a pizza might taste without ever letting you taste the pizza. It's only after you taste the pizza that you begin to appreciate, oh, let me try a pizza from this place and from this place and from this place. And let me go to Italy. And when I go to Italy, I'm going to have a pizza. And that taste, that taste is really what's lacking. And I know why. I understand why. I understand the circumstance. You have this history of the spiritual emphasis on our deen being tied to some practices and circumstances that are certainly not ideal. And so, then this whole notion of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, arose. But just this is the pendulum that we've been swinging through for hundreds of years. This is nothing new. And Imam Ghazali comes and basically takes, there was a very deep academic, deen at that time. And Imam Ghazali takes this and, brings the whole ummah back into moderation towards the middle to understand that there's also an important spiritual realm that cannot be ignored. And that is actually essential for he himself, when you look at the history of what he went through and how he came to the conclusions that he came to. So if we're going to make Islam a class, and just one more class out of the many classes that we've taken, we're going to be it's going to be devoid of so many of the core features of what causes the taste of Islam. And it needs to be, that any knowledge that we gain should result in practice. And if we're doing something and we don't see the core of sharing, love, concern for others, desire to do ibadah, if these things are not coming into our life, then I would argue that there's a problem, there's a disconnect. If we're just filling our mind with a bunch of information and we can quote A, B, and C, and we understand the cool arguments and the interesting academic dimensions of something, but it doesn't translate and effectuate a change in us and create that consciousness of Allah, then where are we? We just got a bunch of knowledge, but we didn't convert that into a true spiritual experience. How can it be? How can it be? How can it be that the sun rises every morning and that we are not so awestruck by the rising of the sun that we just bow to our Lord and say subhanallah? Like, where are we? Where are we? We're more excited about the newest iPhone. Like, the newest iPhone comes out and we're thinking about it all day and we can't wait, and we'll stand up in line for 24 hours in front of the Apple store in order to purchase the next iPhone. But then when the sun moves throughout the day and rises and sets and reaches its zenith, it has zero effect on us. Like, what is this? And it's very interesting that when you look at and I'm sorry, I'm deviating here, but you kind of pressed a button in me.
No, please.
It's very interesting when you look at the ibadat of our deen, the essential core ibadat, they're all tied into these magnificent natural phenomena that just should inspire us to awe. Like, look at every prayer. I know today in a day where there's a timetable and you decide that prayer, and you don't decide, but prayer is set at a certain time based on, but it's based on something. It's based on the movements of the sun. And the fact that you wake up in the morning and the sun is rising it should be so awe-inspiring that it should drive me to the Fajr prayer. And I should just be like, wow, I get a chance to engage with this Lord who effortlessly rotates the universe to cause the sun to rise and produces this light that is so perfect that the earth closer to the sun would burn and the earth further from the sun would freeze. And it just perfectly provides me with the light and the warmth and the beneficial things that I need. How is that? How is that what power is doing that? And all of humanity could literally decide that they want the morning to occur in the night and they wouldn't be able to do it. It's not possible. And that should drive me to just want to engage with this amazing creator and everything around me. Like, look at the perfection of the universe, and it's just all a sign. And if I disconnect all of that and just look at the physics of it, then you make it science. You don't make it religion, right? And science is empty. I don't mean that science is empty in that there's no knowledge in there, but look at today. What is the big movement today? The big movement today is wellness. And you know what wellness is? Wellness is the spirituality for science. Because science came and tried to, science is present. It's been present from time immemorial. So it's not like it's anything new. I'm not putting science down. Science has its place, but science explains the how, right? And now, but that's never going to solve the spiritual problem. The spiritual problem is one in which a person begins to appreciate the why and who has put what force has put all this together. And that is Allah. And now you got people meditating and doing all of these things that are associated with wellness, and they're going to have a positive benefit. I'm not arguing that they don't. They have their place, but we have it. We have it already. We have it in Islam, and the depth that's associated with that is phenomenal. It's amazing. And anybody were to experience that, they would never. They will have questions. Human beings always have questions. Human beings can have doubts, but it would be a very different conversation, if it was in the background of experience. And so spirituality, it is the challenge of this day. We can look up anything on the internet at any time, and there's a lot of knowledge out there, and we're not lacking in the books. Many of the books that we have available to us, that the previous scholars didn't even have available to them because of the limitations of the libraries that they were exposed to. The challenge is to develop that true love of Allah, consciousness of Allah, awe, inspiration of Allah, to just look at every single thing in creation and just be absolutely mesmerized by the Creator, and to appreciate the mercy that He's bestowed upon us and the complexity that's required for us to be able to experience what we experience and to tie it all back into its ultimate reality. That's called Deen.
SubhanAllah. I'm just speechless. Thank you for that awe-inspiring advice. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to enact upon all that you have advised. Ameen. And I think that's a perfect note to end on, inshallah. As it's Maghrib time in Chicago, I'd like to be mindful of Dr. Abdul Sattar's schedule and that of our Muslim audience joining from there. So, Dr. Abdul Sattar, on behalf of everyone here, it has been an absolute honor and privilege to have you with us this evening. We pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala envelops you in His mercy and acceptance for all the incredible work that you've done and continue to do. May He bless you and your family with the very best in all aspects of this life and the next. Ameen. And we ask that you please keep all of us in your du'as, and really listening to you, learning from you, and having our questions answered has been such an inspiring and beneficial experience. And really, it feels like we've honestly unlocked a hidden, most high yield bonus chapter of Pathoma. And as medical students, residents, fellows, and maybe even attendings of this generation, we owe much of our success to you and your work. So on behalf of the MSA at Kansas City University, College of Osteopathic Medicine. We extend our heartfelt thanks to Sheikh Dr. Husain Abdul Sattar and to all those who joined for your time. And to everyone in the audience, I humbly request that you please forgive me for my shortcomings, especially the summaries, reflections, or just hosting in general, if it all didn't turn out how you wanted. But I pray that it was beneficial and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts it. Ameen. And as a quick reminder, if you're interested in Dr. Abdul Sattar's weekly lectures, you can find them on the Sacred Learning website at sacredlearning.org or on Spotify under Sacred Learning. So, Dr. Abdul Sattar, your last word for us as we close.
Yeah, no, it was an honor and pleasure to be able to spend time with all of you this evening. And I just wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Allah